So my name is Sneha Malsetti, and my research question was, to what extent do racial stigmas exist in medical research, and how does it reflect on the American values of trust, transparency, and efficiency? So obviously it wasn't very easy coming to that question. I took my inspiration or exigence from Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth in a particular section where he spoke about consumerism, capitalism, and competition. And he spoke about the price that we as a society pay for those laws. Like, sure that efficiency does come, and wealth and prosperity, but at what cost to society? So all these improved conditions, as he said, do arise. Sometimes society has to pay a cost for them. And within that, I looked at several different fields of study. I initially looked into law and the number of, the discrepancy between races in jail and stuff like that. However, I decided later on that I would look into medical ethics as my narrower field. So to begin, I want to talk about a woman named Henrietta Lacks. She was a black woman. She was a destitute, rather young woman, and she was diagnosed with cervical cancer by a Johns Hopkins gynecologist in 1951. So unbeknownst to her, the gynecologist took her cervical cancer cells and he gave them to a cell biologist, and that person used her cells to catapult almost $1 billion cell genetics and research industry. And her family, nor her, saw a penny of that, and she died in pain and suffering because she was a black woman and she did not have the informed consent or the knowledge to provide that informed consent to the doctors that treated her. So that's where I got my main claim from. I decided that there was a failure in the medical research field to provide informed consent for an inherently vulnerable population, thereby skewing the American ideals of integrity and trust. So as you can see in this political cartoon, this doctor is looking at a group of individuals underneath a microscope and they don't even know it. So much the same way, there are minority ethnic populations that are being watched, you could say, by doctors, and they don't know it because they lack the informed consent to do so. So to begin looking, I decided to look at a lot of past research studies, and one of the biggest ones that I saw was the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which 400 black men who had syphilis were not treated for it. They were watched, I think you could say, for how their symptoms progressed in order to provide a better method of treatment for other people with syphilis. And these African American men were enticed by the researchers providing them burial costs, food, other medication and whatnot. So as you can see, they were taken advantage of because of their inherently vulnerable position in society. And I forgot to note that this took place in the 1930s and 1970s, so almost near the beginning of the civil rights movement to the height of it. This is a more recent example. In 2007, a group of Native Americans, the Havasupai tribe in Arizona, their blood samples were taken in order to discover why the rate of diabetes was so prevalent among them. However, their blood samples, the tribe knew about that. However, the geneticist that was looking at their blood samples used it for other purposes to figure out their genealogy and their origin, which was not informed the tribe, and so a lawsuit took place. And while they were reinstated for their sample donations, this is still a huge example of how a minority population was taken advantage of because they were not provided the informed consent. I'd also like to note that much of the Havasupai Indian tribe did not graduate from high school, so they would not know anything about what the geneticist was talking about other than what they were informed that the biologist or the geneticist or the researchers would be doing with their blood samples. My second claim looked at the number of lawsuits and the number of federal legislation that was passed in order to counteract racial stigmatisms in medical research. So as you can see, the Nuremberg Code and the National Research Act and the Belmont Report are only three of the several guidelines that were passed in the past 100 years to counteract this. However, a lot of this research is blatantly ignored. As I noted, the Havasupai tribe blood samples were taken in 2007, and that goes against the National Research Act and the Belmont Report. So as you can see, although there's a lot of federal legislation, a lot of it's being blatantly ignored by researchers who try to find loopholes. In addition, it's unethical to say that research can be divided along racial fault lines. For example, biologists will often use.
Have to stop. Okay. Go ahead.
What evidence did you gather that you didn't use? Why did you choose not to use it?
A lot of my evidence came from historical research, historical studies that had been done by research universities. And obviously I couldn't include all of that because some of it was biased and other ones were not completely accurate in their information. So for that reason I didn't use a lot of the historical reports I found. In addition, some of the lawsuits, I can't remember what it was called. Like a lot of the lawsuits were also very biased in their origin. So I didn't use them because I felt they would provide a inaccurate basis to my claims.
What might be the real-world implications or consequences of your findings, and what are the implications to the community at large?
So I think what many people would argue is that as a free country with many of these legislation in place, that unethical research is not possible. However, I think through my research I can show those people that not only is it possible, but it's happening very, very commonly because researchers will use their data and divide it along racial fault lines, saying it is because that this group of participants in my study were African American that these results occurred, and that happens today as well.
Okay, thanks. Okay, similarly.